Hey guys, it's Luke Yon, and today I am going to be talking about all the books that I read in September. I read 11 books in September, which is a pretty good number, considering that I went into a little bit of a reading slump that month, and I also started school, so I'm still halfway through October trying to figure out a balance between schoolwork and hanging out with friends and reading and hanging out with my family and doing other fun things. So yeah, it was kind of a rocky month, but I still read a lot, so let's just get into all the books that I read. The first book that I read in the month of September was Wishtree by Katherine Applegate. This is a middle grade story that follows a red oak named Red, who is kind of a prominent figure in this town, if you will, and every year on the first day of May in this town, the townspeople will write down their wishes and put it in an envelope and tie it to one of Red's branches in hopes that their wish will come true. And one day, a new family moves into town, a Muslim family, and at the same time, another family is trying to figure out a way to cut Red down. So the book basically just follows Red and their animal companions as they try to help this Muslim family that is new to town, and also prove why Red is a staple to the community. So it is a little bit difficult to describe this book because it doesn't really have much of a plot or storyline, but despite that, I gave this book 5 out of 5 stars, and it is definitely going to be on my favorite books of the year list. I absolutely loved this story. I thought it was so beautifully written, and I just loved the concept of following a story from the perspective of a tree. It is told in the first-person perspective of Red, and I think that it was just such a brilliant choice, and so creative, and you can count on Katherine Applegate to always have just the most creative main characters, narrators, and I just absolutely loved the way that the story was told. And I absolutely, even though there is kind of not much of a plot, I loved the way that Katherine Applegate approached it with this Muslim family. It was very respectful in my opinion, and I read some Own Voices reviews that said the same thing, and I loved that Red was trying to fulfill one of the wishes that it got, and I just absolutely loved that. And this story was just so heartwarming, and I feel like if you just need a pick-me-up book, it's a very, very quick to read. I read it in a single sitting, and it is on Scribd, and it is just such a beautiful story, and I absolutely loved it. I really would like to reread it sometime in the future, and I think that just the prose is so amazing. There are illustrations in this book that really, really add to the story, and it is so engaging, and it just really grips you. And I'm going to try to refrain from saying too much because it is a very short story and I don't want to give anything away. Because I went in really not knowing much other than that it was about a tree. And I think that the way that the story went, while it could have gone a ton of different directions, I think that the choices that Katherine Applegate made were absolutely brilliant, and I fell in love with this story. The next book that I read was Crenshaw by Katherine Applegate. This follows a boy named Jackson who is part of a pretty poor family, and they are kind of always moving, and they really just have absolutely no money as the story progresses. And it follows Jackson and his imaginary friend Crenshaw, who is this giant cat, and it kind of just goes through the day-to-day life of Jackson and this cat. Again, it's very difficult to describe this book because there is not much of a plot, but I end up giving this book a 3.5 out of 5 stars. I don't know why, but I went into this book thinking that it was going to be told from the perspective of Crenshaw the cat, because I thought it was just such an interesting idea to tell the story from the perspective of the imaginary friend, but it's actually told through Jackson's perspective, which I kind of feel like lessened the impact a little bit. I don't think Jackson was that great of a main character, personally. I think he was fine to read about, like, it wasn't annoying to read from him or anything like that. And he wasn't like a one-dimensional character or anything. It was just, I feel like, would have been a lot more interesting to see the story from the imaginary friend's perspective, because I thought that would just be such an interesting idea for a book. But so that was a little bit disappointing, and I also just think that the plot wasn't enough to really engage me. This felt very one-note, and it didn't feel as complex and layered as Wishtree for me, and I think reading it right after I read and adored Wishtree was just not the best idea, because it kind of, I felt like I was comparing the two a little bit much, which is to be expected. You know, it's kind of hard to like turn that part of your brain off. But I think that this was just not as skillfully crafted as Wishtree, and I don't think it's a horrible story or anything. Like, again, I gave it 3.5 out of 5 stars. I think it is, there are a lot of great lessons and messages to kids, and this is a kid's book, so I think that's great, but I think that there were a lot of choices that could have been made to the story that weren't, that I think maybe lessened the impact, as I said, or just didn't make it as compelling as it could have been. So that was kind of like my main complaint with the story, and I also just feel like Crenshaw, like, the book is called Crenshaw, which is the imaginary friend, and I don't think it took advantage of that plot as much as it could have, so yeah. 3.5 out of 5 stars. It's not a horrible book. I would still recommend it for kids, but it just, to me, was not as great. After that, I picked up an e-arc that I got from the publisher. I was so lucky to get it, and that book was All My Rage by Sabaa Tahir. This is Sabaa Tahir's first contemporary novel, as I'm sure you all know. Sabaa Tahir is the author of one of my absolute favorite series of all time, the Ember in the Ashes series, which I just adore, and this is her first venture into realistic fiction. And it follows 3 main characters, Misbah, Salahuddin, and Noor. I really don't want to say much about each of them, but they're all Muslim American characters, and it kind of just follows their day-to-day life. And Misbah is actually, her story is told from the past, and she's not in the story as much, but you actually find out she's she is the mother of one of the main characters. One of the other main characters, and it kind of just, again, it goes through their day-to-day life. I don't want to say too much because it is an arc and it doesn't come out until March, I believe, so I don't want to spoil anything. Overall, I did enjoy the story. I ended up giving it a 3.75 out of 5 stars. I don't think that the plot was really that engaging. I think Misbah was absolutely my favorite character. Salahuddin and Noor were fine characters. I don't think there was anything inherently wrong with them. They were, you know, fully dimensional characters, as you would expect from Sabaa Tahir, and they were really well written, but I just don't think that their story was as interesting as Misbah's story, which was a little bit disappointing, because Misbah is actually, her story is the smallest out of all 3 main characters, and I really wish that we had gotten a little bit more of her, because I think that that would have been really, really interesting, and I could have read an entire book from Misbah's point of view, so that was a little bit upsetting to me. I also think that the plot of this book was not very inventive. Like, I feel like Sabaa Tahir is so amazing at conceiving plots and keeping the story going, and I've always been so engaged reading her books, but for this one I felt kind of bored, and I didn't always feel like I was compulsed to keep turning the pages. I always felt like I kind of had to force myself to sit down and read it, and I do really like the themes and the messages of the story, but I think overall the plot was not really that engaging or just that intriguing, in my opinion. I kind of would have wanted a little bit more from the story, and I didn't really get that. One of the things that I did really like about the story were, like, the quote-unquote villains, and I think that's something Sabaa Tahir always excels at. She always makes sure her villains, or her, like, antagonists, I guess, are fully realized, like, 3-dimensional characters. They are real people, and that was evident in this story as well. And I think that also Sabaa Tahir's writing was really, really amazing. There were so many quotes that I bookmarked in, like, on my phone, and that I took screenshots of, because I think that her prose is just immaculate. I also think that the way Sabaa Tahir captured the immigrant experience was very profound, and that was more from Misbah's point of view, and again, that's why I really wish this book was just told through Misbah's point of view, because again, I do really like Salahuddin and Noor, but I think the shining star of this novel was Misbah, and I think we got chapters from her, as I said, but they were very short, and they were, I felt like, very telly and not showy. Like, we were told that things happened, but we didn't actually get to see that, and I think that was kind of missing from the story. There is something, though, about Misbah's chapters that I don't want to say, because it is spoilers, but if you look at my Goodreads review, I put it under a spoiler tag, something that made me kind of raise my eyebrow about Misbah's chapters once we reached the end of the book. So if you have read the book and you want to know, or you don't care about spoilers, you can definitely check my Goodreads review for that. And yeah, I think this is a perfectly fine novel. Again, I gave it 3.75 out of 5 stars, so there wasn't anything inherently wrong with it, but I think I was just expecting a little bit more, and personally, if you were looking for a book about Muslim teenagers and the Muslim experience, I would personally recommend Tahir and Mafi's two contemporary novels, which are A Very Large Expanse of Sea and Emotion of Great Delight, over this one. But I still think that they are very, very different. But I do think that this book was very interesting, and I think that the messages and the themes were extremely valid and great to read about. And I think that many people could take away a lot from this story, whether you are Muslim or not. So I would definitely recommend it, and I would definitely encourage you to pick it up when it comes out next year. After that, I read a short story called Brambles by Intisar Khanani. This is a prequel to Thorn, I believe it is called, which I had been interested in reading Thorn for a pretty long time, and I wanted to read this prequel short story before getting into that, just to see how I would feel about it. And this book was fine. I ended up giving it like a 3 out of 5 stars. It is very, very short. Like, there is essentially no story to this book. That's why I gave it 3 stars. There just wasn't really anything there. Like, the writing was fine. I think the writing was good. The characters, again, it was so short that I could not connect to any of the characters. And I just have realized that I'm not really a big fan of short stories unless it is part of like a series that I absolutely love. And I think it takes a deft hand to write a well-written short story that is like supposed to be like a narrative, if that makes any sense. Like, I think Leigh Bardugo does this really well, but hers are more of like a fairy tale-ish tone to it, so I guess you can't really compare it. But I think a few of the novellas in the Shatter Me series do this really well, but this is kind of just okay. I probably will read Thorn eventually in the future, but this book didn't really compel me that much, and it didn't really sway me either way to pick up that book, so it was fine, but nothing really that astounding. Then I read Tidelands by Philippa Gregory. This is the first book in a historical fiction trilogy, I believe it's a trilogy? I'm not 100% sure. But this book takes place in 1648, if I'm not mistaken, and it follows a woman named Eleanor whose husband has just disappeared, and she is raising their 2 children by herself, and she is outside a church hoping to see the ghost of her husband, when she ends up seeing a man named James, who she ends up hiding in her shed for the night, and that's pretty much it. There's not really much to say about this story because, again, there's not really much of a plot. I don't know why I read so many books this month that don't have a plot, but here we go. And, so yeah, this book was interesting. I really enjoyed it a lot more than I thought I would. I ended up giving it a 4 out of 5 stars. I have read one other Philippa Gregory book in the past, which was The White Queen, and I enjoyed the writing in that book, but I think the writing in this book was so amazing. There were so many quotes that I just loved, and I thought it was so lyrical, and it definitely added to the atmosphere and the mood and the tone of the novel, and I think that that is really hard to do. It's really hard to kind of encapsulate a setting with your writing, with your prose, so I definitely commend Philippa Gregory on that. I also really, really enjoyed Eleanor as a character. I thought she was very well realized, and I definitely enjoyed reading from her, and I think reading about her and her struggles being a woman in England in the 1640s was extremely insightful and hard-hitting. I think that it was very, like, it definitely shed a light on women in this time period, in this country, not this country, in England, and I thought that it was just really well written, and I think you can definitely tell that Philippa Gregory did her research, and so I really commend her on that, and I also think it's very interesting to read a historical fiction novel from the perspective of someone who is not a historical figure. I have not read many books that are like that, and because usually the historical fiction books that I pick up that I gravitate towards are about specific historical figures that I'm interested in, but I really liked how this book incorporates a lot of the history while being from the perspective of a fictitious person. I also really enjoyed Eleanor's brother Ned, and I'm very excited that book 2 in the series follows him a lot more. So that's definitely interesting. I liked James as well. I definitely liked reading about his conflict between, like, his personal beliefs and wants versus what he feels he should do because he is a part of the church and all that sort of stuff. And I definitely liked reading about that conflict that he had with himself. And although he definitely has some explaining to do in the sequel of the things he did in the last 20 to 30% of this book, because that took me by surprise a lot, and that was very shocking. And in regards to Eleanor's children, I thought that her son, Rob, was kind of one-dimensional to me, but Alice, I think her daughter, was very well realized, and I really liked her story, especially towards the end of the novel. So yeah, but in regards to the plot, again, not much happens in this book. The pacing definitely does pick up in the latter half of the book, and it is pretty quick, in the probably last 50 pages or so, and it leads really well into the next book. However, the next book takes place 20 years after this book concludes, so I don't really understand that, and it's kind of upsetting that we've literally missed 2 decades of these characters' lives, once we jump into the second book. I've not picked up book 2 yet, but I definitely plan to soon, because I really don't want to forget a lot of things that happened in this book, because I did already forget a lot of things that happened, but, it was pretty good. I'm definitely pleasantly surprised with how much I enjoyed the book, and I think that I would definitely recommend it if you're looking for a historical fiction book that is told from a time period that I have not seen a lot of books told from. I don't think I can remember a book that I've read that takes place in this time period. So that was very interesting, and I am excited to read book 2, despite the fact that it takes place, there's such a gap between when that book takes place and when this one does. Next, I picked up the Hawthorne Legacy by Jennifer Lynn Barnes. This book is the sequel to the Inheritance games, which I read in August and really, really enjoyed, and since I read it, I had been really anticipating this sequel, and I got around to it soon after it came out. But if you don't know, the Inheritance games follows a girl named Avery who is basically been orphaned. Her father has been absent for her entire life, and her mother has just died, and the only person she has left is her stepsister Libby. But one day she gets a call to come to this random rich guy's mansion in Texas, and she finds out that she is the heir to his multi-billion-dollar fortune. I think it's $40 billion or something. And the only kind of contingency is that she has to live in his house called Hawthorne House for the next year with his entire family whom he has just disinherited. And his grandsons are kind of involved in it, and some of them kind of believe that this is their grandfather's kind of final riddle because he has been obsessed with games for all of his life. And some of them believe that she is a con woman, and some of them think that, she's out to get the family, and it's kind of just a bunch of drama that happens with Avery and the rest of the family, who are all super rich and snobby and horrible people, and this is it was pitched as Cinderella meets Knives Out, and I would definitely agree with that comparison, because if you like Knives Out, you definitely enjoy this series. So as I said, when I read the Inheritance games, I really, really enjoyed it, and I had been anticipating this book for a really, really long time. But I ended up giving this book a 3 out of 5 stars. I don't think I'm the only one who was a little bit disappointed in this sequel, for people that have enjoyed the first installment. For the first 300 pages of this book, I was pretty hooked. There were a lot of twists and turns, and I loved how many complexities and layers were added to this mystery surrounding Avery, because there was a huge bomb that went off at the end of book 1, figuratively, not literally, and it led to a lot of different threads kind of happening, and some stuff blowing open. I'm doing a horrible job explaining this book, but it's really hard to describe sequels, so I apologize. But there was just a lot of things happening in the first 300 pages of this book that really, really intrigued me personally. But then in the last 50 pages of this book, it took a turn, and there was just a lot of things happening with the plot, and especially the cliffhanger, that just made no sense. There were some reveals happening with the mystery that felt so far-fetched that it just didn't make any sense. And it was really, really upsetting to me because it kind of colored the rest of the book for me. Like, as I said, for most of this book, I really, really enjoyed it. Like, the first 300 pages were so compulsively readable and intriguing, and I did like it a little bit less than the Inheritance games, but I still really enjoyed it, and I was like, what are these people talking about? Because I'd seen some very negative reviews for this book from people who loved the Inheritance games, and I was like, I don't know what they're talking about, like, this book is so great. And I really liked that we got to travel in this book, and this was really reminding me of The Vanishing Stair by Maureen Johnson, which is the sequel to Truly Devious, which that series is one of my favorites of all time, and I was like, this series is going to be so great, like, maybe this will be even better than the first book, and then the third book will just blow me out of the water. So I was, like, really hyping this book up for myself as I was reading it, but then things kind of went into a decline. Like, I really liked how the worlds kind of expanded in this book, and how we got more from, like, more things to learn about the family, but it just got so confusing and convoluted that it just became, like, kind of ridiculous, like, that all this was even plausible, because it's not plausible. It just didn't make, as I said, it just didn't make a lot of sense to me. And even the characters in this book felt very watered down. Like, I think Avery was still an interesting character, but I think the four grandsons were just not as compelling as they were in the Inheritance games, and a lot of the family members just were not that interesting, in my opinion. I know this sounds kind of negative, and it sounds like I hate this book. I don't. I ended up giving it like a 3 or a 3.5 out of 5 stars, but I just think that it was pretty messy, and it just became so complex to the point where it was confusing, and I think that the ending was really cheap. Hopefully the third book will be really amazing, but I think the way that this one ended, I don't have many high hopes, so. Next, I read an arc of one of my most anticipated books of next year, and that is This Woven Kingdom by Tahir Mafi. This is the first book in her new fantasy series, and it comes out February 1st of next year, and I was so lucky to get an arc of it, so thank you so much to HarperCollins for providing me with a copy of this book. But this book is a Persian-inspired fantasy. Specifically, it's inspired by the Shahnameh, which was written by Ferdowsi, which is one of the, like, Persia's greatest poets. And it follows two main characters. One is Alizé, and the other is Kamran. I really don't want to say anything about this book, because I went into it really knowing nothing, and also the synopsis that is even on, like, Goodreads is very vague, so, I really think it's best to go into this book not knowing much. Or maybe I'm just saying that because I'm too lazy to explain, but whatever. Like with All My Rage, I don't want to say too much about this book because it doesn't come out for still a couple of months, but I absolutely love this book. I ended up giving it a 5 out of 5 stars. Originally I gave it a 4.75, but upon reflection I was like, no, this is a 5 out of 5 stars. I just loved the way that this was written, and there's not a lot of plot, like, to be honest. This is much more of a character-driven story, and, yeah, I think Alizé and Kamran were both really, really amazing characters, and they were really interesting to follow, so I didn't mind that there was essentially no plot to this book. There was a plot, but it was very contingent on the two main characters, and we kind of flip-flop between their points of view. But the writing in this book, I think, is Tahir Mafi's best. None of the sentences in this book are written with mundane language. Everything is written with drama and theatrics, and it felt just very intriguing to read because the language in this book was just so amazing, and, like, I don't even know how to describe it because the prose was just, like, out of this world. So, like, I think Tahir Mafi definitely upped her game with this book, and since it's told in third person, she was able to, like, delve into her writing a little bit more, I guess, and it was just very shocking to me how well written this book was. I mean, I knew Tahir Mafi was a great writer, but it was just, it was like a whole different stratosphere in this book. My one complaint about the writing is that it did feel a little bit far removed from the characters, and in the beginning I was like, I don't know if I'm going to be able to connect to these people, but by the end I definitely was able to connect with them, and I felt for them a lot, and I think it just took a little bit of time to, like, get immersed in the story, but once I did, I was hooked, like, the whole way through, and despite there being basically no plot, it was still so engaging and addicting to read. I read it in, like, 2 days, and this book is, like, 500 pages, so it was, like, I can't even explain it. I just loved it so much, and it's very difficult to explain books that I adore like this, and also it's really difficult to explain because basically nobody has read this book, and I don't want to say anything that's too spoilery. And even the world building in this book was really, really well done. Usually Mafi is not great at the world building. She's usually pretty, like, vague with her world, and you usually don't know 100% of what's going on, but this book I think was crafted so well. I think it did help that it was also inspired by, like, an existing mythology, so she could kind of pull things from that. I've personally never read the Shahnameh, but after this, I am definitely very intrigued, and I just really liked the world that this was set in, and I loved the Persian influences. I thought it was just so captivating, and I think that it was an amazing world to be in. And I'm definitely excited because the end of this book, I was not expecting that. Like, the last chapter of this book was just like a whole whirlwind, and I cannot wait for the second book in this series. And we're gonna see a lot more of the world in the second book, because this was pretty, like, staying in a few different places and that was it, but book 2 is gonna be, like, so much more expansive and sweeping. So I'm definitely very excited for that, and I cannot wait for other people to get their hands on this book, because it is so good. Next, I reread The Gilded Wolves and the Silvered Serpents in preparation for the Bronzed Beasts. I have an entire 50-minute reading vlog of The Gilded Wolves and the Silvered Serpents, and I have a dedicated reading vlog for the Bronzed Beasts. And I'll link all of those in the description box below, but I'm not really going to talk about these books because I talked about them a ton, and I have dedicated videos to all of them. And then the final book that I read in September was Defy the Night by Brigid Kemmerer. This is the first book in a new fantasy trilogy that takes place in this kingdom that has been plagued by a plague. There is the sickness that is sweeping through the different parts of this kingdom, and there is an elixir that can help people, but only the extremely rich can afford it, and we follow two main characters in this book. The first is Tessa, who is an outlaw, and with her best friend Wes, they try to steal the moonflower, which is the key ingredient to the elixir, which is a crime that can get people hanged and have gotten people hanged. And the other main character is Korik, who is the prince, who is also in charge of, you know, upholding the law and making sure that outlaws like Tessa and Wes are kind of punished for their crimes, if you will. So I really, really enjoyed this book. I gave it a 4 out of 5 stars. I really love the way that Brigid Kemmerer writes her fantasy worlds, because they are very complex and layered for people who love fantasy like I do, but they're also very accessible and easy to fall into for people that are maybe a little bit more new to fantasy or more apprehensive of delving into a high fantasy world. I also think that the characters in her books are always really, really great, because she is primarily a contemporary writer, and so I think even in her fantasy books she is able to develop her characters really well. The plot in this book is not too shocking. Like, there's not a ton that happens in this book, but there is a twist that happens like 100 pages in that had me reeling for a little while, and it kind of just, that is maintained through, like, the rest of the story. I will say that, like the Hawthorne Legacy, the first, like, 300 pages of this book I really, really enjoyed, but for the rest of the book it kind of went downhill a little bit, so I actually would probably give this like a 3.75 out of 5 stars. So yeah, overall, really, really enjoyed this book, and I am very excited for the sequel, especially with the way that this book ended. But that is it for this video. I really hope you guys enjoyed. I'm sorry for the lighting. I'm filming this at like 5 p.m. But that is it. I really hope you guys enjoyed. I'd love to know what books you read in September, and I will see you in my next video. All my social media links are in the description box below, and I'll see you in my next one. Bye!